As the evening deepens, the oil lamps dim to a sullen amber, and the wind carries the faint, sweet rot of the year's final leaves. Long fingers of darkness stretch across the uneven stones of the lane, and somewhere beneath the silence, an older world begins to stir. It is the 31st of October, 1890, and All-Hallows Eve has settled over the land like a held breath. Before we cross that threshold together, allow me a moment to greet you properly. Wherever you are, whether beneath the glow of city lights in America, in a quiet flat above a European street still wet with rain, or halfway around the globe where the sun is only now rising, I'm glad you're here. If you feel like it, drop a note below and tell me where this voice is reaching you and what hour the clock shows outside your window. Is the night thick around you, or are you stealing these minutes before dawn? Pull the quilt a little closer, let the room settle into quiet, and ready yourself for a journey backward through more than 130 years.
If these slow, lamplit tales are to your taste, tap the heart so I know you've passed this way, and consider walking with me again. Your company means more than you might guess. Now come. The air outside is sharp enough to bite. A narrow valley cradles the village tonight, its clustered rooftops exhaling pale threads of wood smoke into the frost. Along the crooked path that serves as the main street, hunched lanterns of carved turnip keep their ancient watch. No bright orange pumpkins here. Those belong to a later age, an ocean away. These are knobbled, earthy things, hacked out with kitchen knives and spooned hollow by calloused fingers. The faces are uneven, savage, almost human in their weariness. Candle flames tremble behind eye holes that seem to remember every Halloween since the days of the Druids. They do not smile so much as grimace, as though they know what is coming. Small groups of children move between the cottages, boots scuffing on stone, breath pluming white. Their coats are handed down and patched, their baskets woven from last year's rushes.
They go door to door, not for sweets, but for solemn duty, a sprig of rosemary laid on each step to guard the threshold, a pinch of salt tossed over a shoulder to blind mischievous spirits, a crust of oat bread left on the sill for the silent visitors no one wishes to offend. Their mothers warned them that on this night the dead walk hungry for notice, and it is wiser to feed a ghost than to slight one. From the square, the church bell tolls 9 slow strokes, each one heavy, deliberate, as if counting heartbeats toward midnight. A farm cart clatters past, its driver muffled to the eyes, the horse's breath glowing like a dragon's in the cold. Hooves ring sharp against the cobbles, then fade, leaving only the wind and the low, mournful cry of an owl somewhere out beyond the hedgerows. The older folk cross themselves at the sound. An owl's voice after dark is never just a bird on Samhain Eve. And so the lane winds on, lit by those grim little turnip faces, while every soul who walks it feels the weight of unseen attention pressing close.
Inside a low stone cottage near the edge of the village, firelight wrestles with the gloom and only just holds its own. The walls are thick, built to keep out centuries of winter, and they carry the faint perfume of peat and wet moss. The oak door, black with age, is barred firm against whatever travels the roads tonight. Around the hearth, a family draws near, their shadows swaying like dancers on the lime-washed plaster. The grandmother, the heart of the house, feeds the fire with careful reverence, as though every stick of wood might be watched. Her shawl, once deep green, has softened to the color of forest moss. It still holds the ghost of lavender picked in brighter months. On her knee rests a wide wooden bowl of apples, their skins burnished crimson and gold by the flames. They are not for eating yet, On this night, an apple is a doorway, a question, a mirror. The children huddle on the braided rug, knees drawn up, eyes reflecting the fire like small, bright animals. The youngest boy inches forward, hungry for the next tale. Their grandmother's voice, low and unhurried, begins to weave the old threads of footsteps that follow behind you on an empty road, yet leave no print in the dust, of candles that burn blue when the dead draw near, of mirrors veiled after sunset because they might show a face that does not belong to the living. Each story is delivered gently, almost tenderly, the way one passes a candle through darkness, carefully so the flame does not go out. At the table their father works in silence, finishing the last of the turnip lanterns. His knife is sure, practiced. The blade rasps softly as it carves a final crooked mouth. Shavings fall like pale petals onto the flagged floor. When he sets the candle inside, the new face joins its brethren on the windowsill, another weary sentinel to stand guard between the warm living and the cold, patient dark beyond the glass. The blade moves with patient certainty, scraping softly as curls of pale turnip flesh drop to the table. There is purpose in every stroke. The eyes must be wide and wild, the mouth a ragged snarl, ugly enough to fool any spirit that mistakes the lantern for one of its own kind. When the last cut is made, the father lowers a nub of tallow candle into the hollow. A match flares, sulfur sharp in the air, and the new face awakens, a leer of orange light that throws trembling shadows up the wall like something half alive. Beside it, on a plain wooden trencher, lie small oat bannocks drizzled with the season's last honey, thick, dark, fragrant with heather. No one in the room will taste them tonight. They are set out for company that has no need of chairs. The old people say the dead grow neither angry nor cruel on this night. They simply grow lonely. Leave them nothing, and by morning a cow may sicken, a child take fever, or the milk turn sour before dawn. A little honey and cake is cheap insurance against sorrow. The scent rises, sweet and golden, threading through peat smoke and the green bite of burning applewood. Outside, the wind changes its voice.
It no longer shakes the shutters. It leans against them, breathing slow and deliberate, as though testing whether the living have remembered to bar the way. Through every chink, it sends the smell of turned earth and cold rain on stubble fields, and beneath that, something older, like a word half remembered on the edge of sleep. The little girl, no more than 6, hugs her straw dolly tighter. Its button eyes catch the fire and throw back 2 tiny coins of light. She burrows against her sister's side, feeling the quick flutter of another heart beneath patched wool. Yet, the room keeps its own small heartbeat, the pop of burning wood, the soft creak of the settle, the steady breathing of people who have nowhere else to go tonight, except deeper into one another's company. Then the wind carries something that is not wind. The children stiffen. Even the dog by the hearth lifts its head, ears pricked toward the door. The sound is faint, so faint it might be imagination. Yet it is there. A thin, papery murmur, like voices speaking all at once from very far away or very near.
The eldest boy can bear it no longer. Curiosity drags him across the flags until his palms meet the icy window pane. He cups his hands to cut the glare and peers into the lane. The turnip lanterns burn steady, each one a small, defiant hearth against the dark. Between their glow, the night lies thick and shining, as though the air itself has turned to black water. For 3 heartbeats, he sees nothing. Then something crosses the road, tall, elongated, gliding more than walking. It has no lantern, no face he can catch, only the suggestion of height and silence. It passes behind one flickering turnip grin and does not come out the other side. He jerks back as if the glass has burned him. The fog of his breath stays on the pane like a ghost of itself. Grandmother sees the shock on him before he can hide it. She rises slowly, joints protesting the hour, and reaches for the small leather pouch that never leaves the mantel. Inside are dried rowan berries, salt, and a pinch of iron filings from the smithy.
She tips a little into the fire. Flames hiss, leap green for a moment, and the sharp tang of protection fills the room like incense. There, she murmurs, more to the night than to the boy. That'll turn aside wandering eyes. Father's knuckles whiten around the spoon he has been shaping for tomorrow's stirring. He does not look up, but the muscle in his jaw jumps once, twice. He has heard that sound before, years ago, when he was the boy at the window. Mother lifts her voice, quiet, unshaken, into an old Gaelic lullaby her own mother used against the dark. The notes are soft as ash settling, yet they carry. One by one, the children let the melody pull them in, leaning together until they are a single small creature with many heads resting against the warmth of the fire. But beyond the walls, the sighing does not stop. It circles the cottage the way a cat circles a mouse hole, patient, listening, waiting for the song to falter or the fire to sink. The murmurs drifted along the slant of the roof, curled down the chimney like thin smoke, and seeped through every crack the masons had never quite sealed. They were not words in any tongue the living still spoke. They were more like the memory of words, fragments of lullabies, snatches of prayers, the echo of names no one in the valley had answered to for 50 years or more. At times they lifted into something almost like weeping. At others they sank so low that the ear could almost believe the wind had tired of pretending. A knot of applewood burst in the hearth with a sharp crack, spitting a red ember onto the flags. The littlest girl flinched hard, driving her face into her sister's woolen sleeve, as though the sound itself had teeth. Grandmother's eyes narrowed. She studied the brief flare of sparks the way sailors once studied clouds for omens. The cottage felt suddenly smaller, a single bright raft adrift on a slow black tide where pale things moved just beneath the surface. At the far end of the short passage, a lone candle kept its vigil in an old brass holder, its flame trembling whenever the air shifted. The hallway smelled of cold stone, mouse nests, and the green rot of centuries. Every board seemed to listen. Every footfall returned a faint, hollow answer from somewhere deeper in the house. The mother rose without a word, took up a square of undyed linen, and walked the length of that watchful corridor. Firelight from the room behind her painted her shadow long and thin, stretching it ahead like a guardian. Beneath the steep turn of the stair stood a little three-legged table no one used for anything else. Upon the cloth she set 3 small offerings: a plain silver thimble, bright as a tiny moon, to keep the needles of the coming year from pricking cruelly; a curling lock of hair bound with scarlet thread, hers, her husband's, and a strand from each child braided the night before; a spray of rowan berries, still red as fresh blood, dried since Lammas, the tree that no witch or restless soul may pass. She placed them in the old order, left, center, right, the way her mother had placed them, and hers before her, back to a time when the priest still turned a blind eye to such things. These were not decorations, they were moorings, ropes thrown out to hold the living world in place while the night tried its strength against the walls. When she straightened, the candle on the table bent violently away from the stairwell, as though an unseen breath had blown from the darkness above. The flame flattened, streamed sideways, nearly died. She spoke 3 soft words in the old tongue,
too low for the children to catch, and the fire righted itself, burning clear again. In the doorway, the children watched, round-eyed. The eldest boy's fingers had found the newest turnip lantern. He gripped it like a shield, the carved face leering over his shoulder into the room. Grandmother gave a small, satisfied nod at the sight of the rowan, and went back to the hidden beads in her lap. Click, 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 counting off protection the way other people counted sheep.
Far off, a farm dog flung a frantic volley of barks into the night, then cut off as suddenly as if a hand had been clamped across its muzzle. After that, nothing. Only the slow clop of a single horse passing the end of the lane, riderless, unhurried, its hooves striking the stones in perfect time with the hearts inside the cottage. The mother returned, carrying the hallway candle. She set it on the mantel beside the freshly carved lantern. For a breath, the two flames bowed toward each other like old friends, then stood tall together, doubling the small circle of safety. The youngest lifted her head at last. Her voice was the barest thread. "Are they certain we're home?" No one answered at once. The embers gave a low, thoughtful throb, and the sweetness of the untouched honey drifted stronger, as though someone unseen had leaned close to breathe it in. Outside, the whispers gathered, patient as tide, waiting for the fire to sink or the song to falter. Inside, the little island of light held, for now. The hush inside the room had grown so dense it felt like breathing water. Hearts beat slow and deliberate, as though afraid to disturb whatever waited on the other side of the walls. Then it came. 3 measured knocks against the yoke, neither timid nor violent, but patient, as though the visitor had all the years in the world and intended to use them. The thick door shivered in its frame, a faint, dull thud that seemed to reach straight into the chest. Every child turned to stone. The eldest girl's hands froze mid-air, fingers curled like broken wings. The little one drove her face into the straw dollies so hard the button eyes left red marks on her cheeks. Father's knuckles went white around the half-finished spoon. The harmless bit of ash wood now looked more like a cudgel. Grandmother's lips kept moving, soundless, urgent, the beads flying through her fingers faster than rain on a slate roof. A second knock followed, slower, almost courteous. The pause between each rap stretched just long enough to let hope rise and die again. Mother did not move toward the latch. No one born in that valley would have dreamed of it. Instead, she crossed to the little table beneath the stairs, opened the folded cloth once more, and crumbled a fresh handful of dried sage and vervain across the offerings. The sharp, cleansing scent flared up like a small, invisible wall. Outside, something shifted its weight on the stones. A single, dragging footfall, reluctant, as though the earth itself tugged at the heel. Then nothing. Even the wind held its tongue. Father spoke at last, voice low enough that the words seemed to come from the hearth itself. "No one opens. Not tonight." The children nodded, small, fierce nods. They had been taught the bargain since they could walk. The dead are not cruel, only hungry for company. Give them entry on this night, and they may never leave. The house would belong to yesterday forever. The turnip lantern on the sill suddenly ducked and flared, its carved mouth stretching wider as the flame bowed toward the door. Beside it, the hallway candle drowned in its own wax, a slow white tear sliding down the brass. Shadows on the wall lengthened, thinned, pressed forward like listeners with no faces. Then, from somewhere out beyond the last cottage, a laugh drifted back, light, hollow, the kind of sound a throat makes
when it no longer remembers why it once found things funny. It floated above the roofs for a moment, weightless, then scattered into the dark. The fire answered with a sudden snap, throwing a handful of sparks up the chimney like bright, desperate birds. Grandmother lifted a crooked finger. The eldest boy understood at once. He rose, lifted the heavy iron pot from its hook, and carried it to her, arms trembling under the weight of warm metal. She plunged her hand into the fine gray ash at the bottom, brought it out dusted like a corpse, and walked to the door. There, on the wide flagstone that served as threshold, she let the ash fall in a thin, unbroken line, each grain settled with the hush of snow on coffin lids. Fire's child and fire's guardian, what has known flame may not be lightly crossed.
When the last pinch drifted down, the room seemed to breathe out. The candle straightened. The turnip flame stood tall again. Even the dog by the hearth lowered its head and slept. Father leaned back against the settle, though his ears stayed pricked to every night sound the valley had ever known. The creak of a cart that carried no living driver. The soft brush of something passing between the lanterns without disturbing their light. The faint, wet drag of a foot that had forgotten how to lift properly from the ground. The ash line glimmered faintly, a pale scar across the dark stone. Beyond it, the night waited. Quiet now, almost polite, but waiting all the same. None of the ordinary night sounds reached them now. No creak of a gate left unlatched. No fox barking in the bracken. No late cart rumbling home from the inn. Only a listening hush, thick as wool, and beneath it the faintest tremor, as though the darkness itself had grown skin and was pressing close to feel their warmth.
Mother rose again, silent, and added 2 more oatcakes to the little plate. The honey caught the firelight like molten amber, slow and heavy, its scent rising to mingle with the lingering bite of sage and the darker note of peat. It was meant to soothe what had no tongue left to taste. The smallest girl lifted her head just enough to speak, voice no louder than the brush of moth wings. Will the ashes stop them coming in? Grandmother's eyes, pale as winter sky, rested on her. They don't stop them, love. They only remind them where the living ends and the other place begins. The boy opened his mouth, a question forming, but the night outside pressed so hard against the walls that words felt dangerous. Far away across the stubble fields, a single crow flung its harsh, broken cry into the dark. The sound scraped across the roof like a nail. Every flame in the room dipped as though bowing. Grandmother dipped 2 fingers back into the ash pot and reached high above the lintel. There she drew a rough cross, the gray smudge sinking into the old oak like smoke into cloth. As her hand fell, something answered, a slow, deliberate scrape along the shutter, the idle tracing of a single fingernail, testing the grain. Once. Twice. Then nothing. No one breathed loudly. Fear shown plainly was an invitation. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it began, the way a finger lifts from a page when the reader has found what he was looking for. Grandmother settled back, folding her hands over the worn beads. "The line holds," she whispered. "Let it hold till cockcrow." Then the bell in the steeple spoke. One solemn stroke rolled down the valley, deep enough to rattle the pots on their hooks and thrum inside the bones of the house. The echoes lingered, slow to die. A second stroke followed, and a third, until the full 12 had fallen, each one heavier than the last, marking the hinge of the year when the dead are said to stand closest. "The hour between the hours," Grandmother said, so softly the words barely disturbed the air. "Mind your souls now."
Father stood, took the long iron poker from its rest, and walked to the nearest shutter. He laid his bare palm against the wood. The chill that came through was not October's. It was the cold of deep wells and newly dug earth. He stayed there a long moment, listening. Then they all heard it. Footsteps on the leaf mast outside, unhurried, circling. A measured tread that paused at each corner of the cottage as though counting windows, weighing doors. The sound passed from the front, along the gable end, around the back. Never hurried, never faltering. Dry leaves rustled and were stilled, rustled and were stilled, as though something walked that had no weight to crush them. Mother's lullaby began again, thinner now, a thread of sound spun fine enough to stitch the dark together. The children leaned into one another until they were one small knot of warmth and terror. The youngest pressed her ear to her sister's ribs and listened to the frantic drum inside, trying to believe it louder than the walking outside. The footsteps stopped. The fire gave a single weary pop, and a ribbon of sparks rose and died. Into the quiet slipped a new scent, cold iron, thin and sharp, the smell of old graves when the spade first bites earth. It curled above the honest reek of wood smoke and honey and settled over the room like frost. Grandmother's beads never paused. Click, slide, click, slide. Each bead a small black stone dropped into deep water, sending out rings of protection no eye could see. Her lips shaped the old Latin under her breath, the words worn smooth by centuries of frightened tongues. The cottage waited, bright and breathing, while the night outside stood motionless, patient as stone, listening for the next heartbeat to falter. Without warning, the turnip lantern on the sill roared awake. The flame inside lunged sideways, flattening itself against the inner wall of the root until the pale flesh sizzled and blackened. For one heartbeat, the carved mouth seemed to widen of its own accord, stretching into a leer too knowing to belong to mere vegetable. A thin ribbon of smoke curled up, acrid and sudden.
The children's breath caught in a single sharp gasp. Father was already moving. He reached the lantern in 2 strides, fingers closing around the hot rim. The instant he touched it, the flame shrank, docile again, as though it had only been waiting for a living hand to remind it of its place. He steadied the turnip, wiped a smear of soot from his thumb, and came back to his chair. Yet the room felt different now, thicker, the way water feels when something large has just passed beneath the boat. Midnight had slipped inside while no one was looking. High on the mantel shelf rested the old looking-glass, oval, its silver gone cloudy with age. 11 months of the year it stayed swathed in linen, but on this night it was always uncovered, wiped with a soft cloth, and set upright so that way one sets a window that must be opened whether one wishes to or not. Grandmother had said long ago that on Samhain the glass grew thin, and what stood behind a person might choose to step forward.
The eldest girl found her voice. What does it show, truly? Grandmother watched the fire instead of the mirror. Sometimes a shadow that has no owner, sometimes a face you'll wear when you're old, or a face that once wore yours. And sometimes, her words thinned to a breath, sometimes it shows an empty room, and that emptiness hungers. A fresh log of pine thudded onto the embers. Resin hissed and flared, filling the air with sharp green scent. Mother lifted a new candle, no longer than her thumb, and set it on the small table before the glass. The flame in the room burned bright and quick. The flame in the mirror burned slower, heavier,
as though the air on the other side were syrup. The eldest boy could not help himself. He leaned in. At first, the reflection was only the cottage, the hearth, the huddled family, the crooked lantern. Then the edges of his own face began to soften, the way a pebble blurs under moving water. The eyes in the glass grew darker, deeper, until he felt he was staring down a second chimney into another fire altogether.
"Back," grandmother said, not loudly, but the word cut like cold iron. He stumbled away. She tossed a handful of ash onto the flames. They roared up white and fierce, and when the glare died, the mirror was only a mirror again, dull and ordinary. Father crossed the room in 3 quiet strides, lifted the cloth, and let it fall across the glass like a shroud. For a moment, the only sound was the small, busy voice of the fire. Then the ceiling spoke. A slow, deliberate groan rolled overhead, the protest of old beams bearing weight they had never been meant to carry. Dust sifted down in pale motes, drifting through the firelight like ash from a colder burning. Another step, measured, patient, crossed the non-existent floor above their heads. A third. The sound moved from the chimney breast toward the far corner, paused, returned, as though someone paced the length of a room that had never been built. The cottage had one story. Everyone in it knew that as surely as they knew their own names.
Grandmother's beads rattled like hail on slate. Mother's lullaby faltered, then steadied, thinner than spider silk. The children pressed so close together they seemed a single creature with too many eyes. Father stood beneath the settling dust, head tilted, listening to footsteps that walked on nothing. His hand closed tight around the iron poker as though it were the only real thing left in the world. The pacing stopped directly above the hearth. A long silence stretched, thin and bright as a drawn wire. Then the turnip lantern gave one last defiant flare, and the unseen walker overhead took another step that creaked no board at all. The creak came again, deeper this time, as though the roof timbers themselves had grown weary of pretending there was nothing above them. Fine plaster dust drifted down in slow, continual motes, catching the firelight like ash from a cold star. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every soul in the room felt the same slow pressure settling over their shoulders. Father's grip on the poker was so tight, the iron left white prints in his palm. Yet he stayed rooted, staring upward as though he could burn a hole through the ceiling with looking alone. Mother gathered the children beneath the shelter of her shawl until they were a single trembling shape. The youngest pressed the straw doll's button eyes to her own cheek, as if the little painted face might see what she could not bear to. Grandmother's lips never stopped. The Latin rolled out soft and relentless, centuries of frightened women woven into every syllable. The beads clicked like slow rain on a coffin lid. Then came a new sound, the faint, deliberate drag of heavy fabric across boards that were not there, a trailing hem sweeping dust that had not fallen in 100 years. It moved from the chimney breast to the far corner and paused, directly above the hearth, as though whatever wore that cloth had stopped to warm its hands. The fire answered with a sudden spiteful hiss. Flames shrank to sullen blue, and a breath of graveyard cold rolled across the floor, raising the hairs on every neck.
The eldest boy could not help himself. "There's no upstairs," he whispered, the words slipping out before fear could catch them. Father's glance flicked to him, sharp, almost angry, then softened at once into something older than anger, recognition. A single finger rose to his lips. "Quiet, lad. Names draw them. Words are doors." The pacing resumed, slower, almost idle, as though the walker had all the time that ever was.
The cottage itself seemed to strain upward, rafters stretching like ribs to make room for what had no right to space. Then, nothing. The fire collapsed into a nest of embers. Shadows poured into the corners and rose like black water. The turnip lantern bowed so low its flame kissed the sill. And into that hush slid a whisper, not from the ceiling, not from outside, but from the air itself, folded inside the room with them. It had no shape, only texture, the memory of a voice, the sigh a name makes when it is spoken for the last time.
Grandmother's hand rose, trembling, and drew a small cross in the smoke-heavy air. "They only walk where thought allows," she said, voice steady as iron. "We allow nothing." The ashes across the threshold lay undisturbed, a pale, unbroken thread. Slowly, slowly, the fire found its courage again. Flames lifted, small at first, then taller, painting the walls with moving gold. Warmth crept back into the room the way dawn creeps over hills. Grandmother lifted the little bundle of rue, thyme, and rowan, held it to the flames until it flared green and sharp, then waved it slowly so the fragrant smoke drifted into every corner. "The air remembers whose house this is," she murmured. "Let it carry the message." The smoke wound upward in deliberate spirals, brushing the rafters, curling around the shrouded mirror, settling over the children like a gentle hand. Father stepped to the shutter once more and laid his palm flat against the wood. The cold beyond was still there, patient, depthless, but it no longer pressing quite so hard. Through the narrowest crack he could see the village lanterns glimmering down the lane, each crooked face staring back toward the cottage as though keeping count of who still burned bright inside. He let his breath fog the glass and spoke so low only the night could hear. "It's not empty out there that's empty," he said. "It's listening." Behind him, the fire settled into a steady, honest roar. The turnip flame stood straight again. The children breathed in the clean bite of burning herbs, and for the first time in hours, the room felt like their own once more. Above them, the hearth, the invisible walker took one final, almost regretful step, and was gone. The cottage exhaled. The night, for now, had been refused entry. The children crept nearer the hearth until the heat touched their cheeks like a living hand. The eldest boy let his fingertips wander along the turnip lantern's jagged mouth, tracing every notch and hollow as though the carved face might speak if he read it correctly. The littlest girl risked one eye from behind her sister's sleeve. The firelight slid across the floorboards in slow rivers of gold, and for a moment the room felt almost ordinary again. Only the corners refused to surrender. The shadows there rose and fell in a slow, tidal breathing. Far off, a fox cut the night with 3 sharp barks. The sound skidded over the dark fields, struck the hills, and tumbled away into nothing. Closer by, the orchard answered, a sudden patter of dead leaves racing along the ground, quick and light, the way children run when they are pretending no one is chasing them. Every small heart in the room paused mid-beat. Grandmother lifted the silver thimble from its place beneath the stairs. Firelight ran across its curve like water. "Little things remember for us," she said, soft enough that the flames themselves seemed to listen. She pressed the thimble's open mouth into the ashen line at the door. When she drew it away, a perfect silver circle glinted in the gray dust, bright as a dropped coin.
Mother's humming rose again, low and sweet, the same notes women in that valley had used to rock both the living and the restless to sleep. The tune wound through the rafters, gentle but unbreakable, stitching warmth into every crack the night had found. Outside, the wind turned over like a sleeper. carrying the smell of wet bark, bruised apples, and frost that had not yet made up its mind to fall. The turnip lanterns along the lane blinked, 1, 2, 3, as though agreeing to something no one inside had spoken aloud. The fire settled into an easy, honest glow, breathing in slow pulses that matched the rise and fall of the children's chests. Smoke, honey, sage, and the faint iron scent of deep earth braided together until the air itself felt like a blanket pulled to the chin. Grandmother leaned close to the hearth, fingertips brushing the warm rim of the ash pot. She spoke not to the family, but to the fire. Words too soft for any ear but the flames. Sparks leapt in answer, carrying her murmured blessings up the chimney and out across the dark like tiny lanterns of their own. Another sound drifted in, no more than a hush of cloth across the floorboards inside the room. Father's hand moved an inch toward the poker, then stopped. The sound did not repeat. Perhaps it had only been the house timber cooling, or perhaps something had brushed the edge of the ash line and thought better of it. Grandmother let a final pinch of ash fall through her fingers. It drifted down in a pale, deliberate snow, settling over the embers with a faint hiss. Step lightly, weary ones. Keep the path wide beyond these walls. There is room enough for you there. The children watched the sparks climb, each bright crumb a small guide leading whatever wandered past the cottage and away across the fields, away toward the hills where no light burned and no door stood open. Warmth folded itself around them, certain and steady. The shadows drew a fraction farther into their corners, as though politely declining a second invitation. The lullaby rose and fell. The fire crackled its low, contented song, and for the first time since the church bells struck 12, the room felt wholly, fiercely theirs again. Outside, the night kept its vigil, patient as ever. Inside, the small circle of light held, bright and breathing, until the first pale hint of morning should come to finish what ash and song and stubborn love had begun. Outside, the turnip lanterns along the lane rocked once, twice on their sticks, as though bowing to the little cottage that still held its ground. The road itself lay deserted, yet the darkness felt crowded, the way a church feels crowded when no living soul is inside. Mother reached across and tucked a loose fold of shawl around the youngest's shoulders, the small gesture anchoring them all. The fire answered with a cheerful snap, tossing a handful of golden sparks that drifted, hesitated, and vanished, like messengers sent upward and gently refused. Inside the room, the air had grown thick and sweet. Peat, honey, singed turnip, crushed sage, all of it braided together into something almost solid, a living blanket drawn over the family. The cottage breathed with them, slow and steady, a small, stubborn heart beating inside the vast body of the night. The lanterns on the table kept their crooked watch. Their glow spilled across the floorboards in shifting pools, making the carved faces appear to wink, to frown, to wait. The eldest boy could not look away. The longer he stared, the more the flames seemed to pulse in time with something older than the hearth. He half raised his hand, then let it fall, afraid the light might answer if touched. Grandmother let the rosary rest in her lap. The beads caught the fire and threw back tiny, secret glimmers. "They do not stay where they are seen for what they are," she said. So quietly the words barely left her lips. "Keep the fire bright, keep the gifts sweet, and they will drift on, same as cloud before the moon." A soft scrape came from just beyond the door.
No knock, no wait, only the suggestion of a footfall testing whether the ash line still held. The family turned to stone. The sound lingered, curious, almost courteous, then slid away along the wall like a finger drawn across wet slate. A moment later, the leaves outside rustled once, resigned, and the night folded itself back into listening silence.
Mother fed the fire another log of applewood. Flames leapt gladly, hissed, then settled into a deep, contented glow that pushed warmth into every corner. She stirred the embers with the poker. Sparks spiraled upward like bright fish released into a darker stream. The scent that rose was rich, almost edible, charred fruit, smoke, the ghost of summer orchards. The youngest child risked a full glance now. The nearest turnip grinned at her across the room, its jagged mouth softened by the firelight into something almost kindly. She managed the smallest of smiles back, the first since dusk. Through the slats of the shutters, the orchard stretched away, black trunks and bare branches etched against a sky the color of old pewter. A blade of moon hung low, sharp enough to cut. Leaves lay heaped beneath the trees, damp and fragrant, breathing out the slow perfume of rot and cider and endings. The wind combed through them gently, turning them over like pages in a book no one alive could still read.
Inside, the cottage held its breath and its warmth in perfect balance. The lanterns kept their crooked vigil. The fire spoke its low, continuous prayer of crackle and spark. Mother's hum drifted on, threadbare but unbroken. And the night, vast and patient, leaned close against the walls, listening to the small, defiant heart beating within, waiting for dawn the way a courteous guest waits to be asked to leave. The scent that drifted through the chinks was both sweet and sharp. Rotting apples left too long on the branch, frost-bitten earth, wood smoke from 100 chimneys long gone cold. It was the smell of every October that had ever settled over the valley. The eldest girl rose on silent feet and crossed to the window. Her breath bloomed white against the pane. Beyond it, the village lanterns glimmered like low stars caught in the grass. Their light reached only so far, and where it ended, the darkness began in earnest, thick, velvety, watchful. She pressed her palms to the cold sill and felt the night press back. Grandmother spoke without turning.
"The trees remember everything," she said, voice soft as ash settling. "Every foot that ever passed beneath them, every name spoken in their shade. They keep better watch than we do." A shiver walked the girl's spine, not quite fear, more the feeling of being seen by something ancient and courteous. Father sat motionless, firelight carving deep hollows beneath his eyes. He stared past the shutters into the orchard as though he could read the dark the way sailors once read clouds. The weight of centuries leaned against the cottage walls. He felt it in his bones the way an old horse feels thunder long before the sky darkens. From the orchard came a slow rustle, measured, unhurried, the sound of something moving between the trunks that knew exactly how much noise a body may make without being called rude. The youngest child pulled her doll so close its button eyes left small moons on her cheek. Mother's hand settled on the small, shaking shoulder, steady as stone.
The turnip lanterns on the table answered the draft with a sudden dip and flare. For an instant, the carved shadows stretched across the wall like long fingers reaching toward the window, then snapped back as the fire gave a petulant hiss and reclaimed the room. The eldest boy's whisper barely stirred the air. "The trees are looking at us." Grandmother's laugh was low, warm, dry as autumn leaves. "Of course they are, love. We looked first. Fair is fair. As though in agreement, the orchard quieted. The rustling folded itself away. The wind drew a single slow breath through the branches, and the night exhaled. The family drifted back to the hearth without needing to be called. They settled into the small circle of gold the fire allowed them, shoulders touching, knees drawn up. Grandmother's beads resumed their soft clicking, a patient heartbeats against the greater silence. Mother's lullaby returned, thinner now, but unbroken, the same notes that had gentled generations of frightened children in that valley. Embers glowed like a slow, faithful heart. Warmth rose and wrapped them round.
The ash across the threshold lay undisturbed, the silver circle of the thimble still shining like a tiny sealed gate. Far away, an owl loosed one mournful cry that drifted over the fields, circled the cottage once, and was gone. An old messenger, carrying word that the hours were passing, that the hinge of the night had begun, very slightly, to swing the other way. Inside, the fire crackled its low, approving song. Outside, the orchard kept its courteous watch, leaves barely stirring, moonlight thin and well-mannered on the frozen branches. And the small cottage, one bright bead on a long, dark string of October nights, held steady, warm and breathing, until the first pale rumor of morning should find its way down the valley and give the waiting dark permission to leave. The lanterns down the lane kept their small, stubborn watch, each carved face glowing like an old friend who refuses to leave the doorstep. Their light barely reached the cobbles, yet it was enough to hold the road in place, to remind the darkness where the village ended and the wilder night began.
Father moved among them, slow as a man walking through water. His hand brushed the back of the eldest boy's chair, a silent promise, I am here, I am still here. He paused at the door, head tilted, listening to the small, ordinary noises the night allowed itself, a leaf skittering over stone, the wind feeling its way along the thatch, the soft creak of branches that had stood 100 winters and intended to stand 100 more. Unease brushed him, but the rituals were older than unease. Ash, salt, honey, and stubborn silence had kept this house safe before he was born, and would keep it after he was gone. Grandmother's voice drifted across the glow like smoke. Every rustle is a visitor, every shadow a traveler. We greet them with good manners and a locked door, and they go on their way. The eldest boy felt the words settle over him, heavier than wool, warmer than fear. Outside, things might watch. Inside, the fire answered for them all. Mother drew the children nearer, fingertips smoothing hair damp with nervous heat. The youngest gave a small, contented sigh. The dolls slipped a little in her loosened grip, button eyes catching the fire like tiny dark moons. The wind outside found a new note, low, almost tuneful, threading between the orchard trunks and slipping its fingers beneath the shutters. It carried the smell of turned earth and the ghost of cider, the scent of every harvest that had ever ended. Grandmother lifted her head, listening with the same patience the trees showed. "The wind remembers voices," she said. "Some belong to people we once knew, some to people we will never meet. Most are only passing through. Listen long enough and you'll hear which are which." The eldest girl rested her brow against the cool pane, feeling the faint tremor of the wind's song in the wood. The youngest burrowed deeper into her sister's side, breathing in wool and warmth and the steady thump of another heart. Embers leapt in slow spirals, bright as fireflies. The turnip lantern on the table grinned its uneven grin, and for a moment the carved eyes seemed to soften, as though it too had heard the wind's old lullaby and chosen to stand guard a little longer. A single dry leaf scraped along the path outside, scratch, pause, scratch, then was lifted and carried away. The lanterns along the lane flickered once, a courteous blink, and steadied again. Mother stood, arms spread like wings above the huddled children, gathering the room's warmth and pressing it down over them the way one presses a quilt around sleeping travelers. The lullaby she hummed had no words left. It was only breath and tune now, older than language, strong as iron. Firelight, wind song, the soft click of beads, the slow heartbeat of the house, everything wove together into one quiet chord. It rose through the rafters, slipped out beneath the eaves, and drifted across the orchard. We are still here. We see you. Pass on. And the night, listening, inclined its head and did just that. Father's voice settled over them like a heavy quilt, low and unhurried. Even the blackest shadow has its place, and even the stillest wind keeps its own counsel. We mind our manners, and the night minds its. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of every generation that had sat in that same circle of firelight. The family drew nearer until there was no space left between heartbeats. Above them, the attic waited, a dark, hushed country of its own. Old beams, blackened by centuries of smoke, stretched like the ribs of some sleeping creature. Dust lay thick as felt on the floorboards. A single footstep would have sounded like a drum. Trunks stood sentinel, their leather cracked and corners bruised, guarding folded linens that still carried the faint scent of lavender from a bride who had died before Queen Victoria ever came to the throne. A child's wooden horse, paint long flaked away, kept its silent gallop in one corner. Nothing moved, yet everything listened. A cold tongue of air slipped down the stairwell, tasting of frost and iron. It lifted the fine hairs at the children's napes and fluttered the hem of Mother's apron.
The eldest boy felt it slide along his collar and shivered, half fear, half wonder, as though the house itself had leaned down to breathe on him. Grandmother rose, joints creaking like the boards she trod. She lifted the steadiest of the turnip lanterns. Its glow settled on her face and made her eyes very bright. One slow step at a time, she climbed toward the attic door. Each stair answered her with a soft complaint, the way old friends grumble when woken. At the narrow landing she paused, laid her palm against the warped oak, and spoke so quietly the words barely left her lips. "We see you, old ones. We keep the bargain. Rest easy." Then she opened the door no wider than a handspan and lifted the lantern inside. Amber light spilled across the floorboards, catching 1,000 floating specks of dust that drifted like slow golden bees. Shadows leapt along the rafters, long, thin, attentive. For a breath, the attic seemed to inhale, beams shifting almost imperceptibly, as though the whole room straightened to look at the light. A soft sigh, not wind, not boards, drifted down the stairwell, patient and ancient. The sound a house makes when it chooses to forgive the living for still being alive. Grandmother traced a small sign in the air with the lantern, murmured 3 words too old for any of the children to catch, and drew the door closed again. The latch fell with the gentlest click. Downstairs the fire answered with a sudden cheerful pop, as though approving the courtesy shown above. Father let his hand rest on the banister a moment longer, listening. Nothing followed grandmother down but the faint smell of dust and cold wood and the sense that something up there had settled back into its long watch. Mother guided the children into the warmest corner, settling them like birds under her shawl. The youngest loosened her grip on the doll at last. Its button eyes glinted once in the firelight, and were still. On the windowsill, the single candle bowed to the draught, its flame stretching thin and tall, painting trembling ladders of shadow across the wall.
The eldest girl watched, fascinated, as the reflection in the glass seemed to reach toward her, then retreat, reach, retreat, like something testing the strength of the boundary between inside and out. Grandmother returned to her chair, set the lantern carefully on the table among its crooked brothers, and took up her beads again. The attic had been greeted, the bargain renewed. Nothing more was required. Outside, frost began its silent creep across the orchard grass. Inside, the fire burned clear and steady, the lanterns kept their uneven smiles, and the family sat wrapped in the small, fierce glow that told the night, politely, firmly, that this house was still spoken for. The hours moved on, slow as embers settling, and the cottage held its quiet vigil, warm and breathing, until the first pale blade of dawn should slide between the hills and gently dismiss every shadow that had waited so patiently at the door. The orchard trees stood black against the thin moon, their limbs weaving slow, silent patterns that only the night understood. A breath of frost slipped through the shutter's gap and kissed the eldest girl's cheek, sharp as a secret.
Grandmother lifted her hand above the windowsill candle, fingers spread like a star. "This little fire is a gatekeeper," she murmured. "It shows the wandering ones where the road is open and where the threshold is shut." She let a final pinch of sage fall onto the embers. The leaves flared green for an instant, then curled into fragrant smoke that drifted through the room like a slow, deliberate benison. Outside, the village lanterns answered with a soft blink of agreement. A single knock, quiet, almost apologetic, brushed the shuttered door, not demanding, only reminding. The sound hung in the air for the length of one heartbeat, then dissolved into the hush. Grandmother's beads moved faster, a whispered Ave slipping between each click. The candle flame bowed, straightened, and burned clear again. Father rose without haste. The children leaned into Mother's shawl as though it were a fortress wall. The youngest's sigh was small and warm against her sister's neck. Another sound rose, not from the door this time, but from beneath their very feet. A faint rustle, like dry leaves trapped inside the boards, or breath moving through the bones of the house itself.
It had no words, only the suggestion of words, the memory of voices that once walked these floors in heavier shoes. The eldest boy bent forward, ear almost to the rug. The whisper curled upward, curious, tasting the air. Grandmother's gaze dropped to the floorboards. "They speak softly," she said, calm as winter water, "so we will lean closer and forget the line we drew." Father knelt, his broad palm settled on the oak plank, steady, claiming. The whispering paused, considered, then sank away, retreating along the grain of the wood the way a tide retreats from a seawall. The floor grew still beneath his hand, warm again, ordinary again. He stayed there a moment longer, letting the house feel the weight of living blood and bone, then rose and returned to his chair. No one needed telling. The boundary had been minded. Mother's lullaby resumed, softer than before. A thread of sound spun fine enough to stitch the night together. The candle on the sill burned straight and tall. The turnip lanterns kept their crooked smiles, The fire settled into its low, honest song. Outside, the orchard breathed once, a slow, courteous exhalation, and was quiet. Inside, the small circle of light held everything that mattered: warmth, memory, stubborn love. The shadows leaned close, listened, and finding the door still barred by ash and song and watchful hearts, turned away to wait for another year. The cottage kept its vigil, patient as the trees, certain as the coming dawn. The candle on the sill dipped once more, a curious bow to something only it could see, then rose again, tall and unwavering. A single shadow lingered just beyond the ash line, darker than the rest, shaped like a cloak with no wearer. It pooled on the floorboards the way spilled ink pools, slow, deliberate, listening. The eldest boy felt its attention settle on him the way cool air settles on skin. He did not flinch. He remembered grandmother's quiet rule: meet the gaze, but do not speak first. Grandmother's beads moved without haste. It only waits to be noticed, she said, voice soft as thistledown. Give it a calm heart, and it will take nothing more.
Father stayed on one knee beside the threshold, palm resting lightly on the boards as though greeting an old neighbor across a low wall. "We see you," he said, low and even. "We keep the old bargain. Pass on when you're ready." The shadow wavered, thinned, gathered itself again. For a breath, it seemed almost to lean forward, curious, the way a traveler might study a warm window from the cold lane. The turnip lantern answered with a sudden flare, its carved mouth stretched wider, then relaxed into its familiar crooked grin, as though something had asked a question and received a satisfactory reply. Grandmother let a final thread of ash drift from her fingers. It fell across the threshold like a drawn curtain, gray and weightless and absolute. Where it touched, the shadow folded in upon itself, not hurried, not afraid, simply accepting that the visit was over. It slid backward along the floorboards, thinning, until it was only another fold of ordinary darkness. The candle on the sill straightened. The fire gave a small, contented crackle, as though clearing its throat. Outside, the orchard branches scraped once more against each other, a soft, courteous applause, and were still. Mother's lullaby rose again, warm and wordless, gathering the children close. The youngest lifted her head, blinked at the place where the shadow had been, and finding nothing there, let her eyes drift shut against her sister's shoulder. Father rose, brushed the ash from his palm, and settled back into his chair. The room smelled only of wood smoke, sage, and the last faint sweetness of honey now. The boundaries held. Somewhere far off, a cock crowed once, uncertain, premature, but it was enough. The night, hearing the promise stitched into that mistaken note, began, very slightly, to loosen its hold. The family breathed together, warm and unbroken, while the small cottage kept its quiet vigil for the few gentle hours that remained. The lanterns along the road kept their crooked watch, the orchard kept its patient silence, and the shadows, having been met with steady courtesy, drifted on toward morning. The knock fell again. 3 measured taps, neither timid nor bold. The sound of knuckles that have forgotten the weight of flesh, yet still remember courtesy. The room stilled so completely that the fire itself seemed to listen. Grandmother's beads paused mid-click. "We greet," she said softly, "but we do not open. That is the old agreement." Father stood before the door, poker loose in his hand, broad shoulders filling the small space like a living bar across the latch. He laid his free palm flat against the oak, warm from the hearth on the inside, cold as iron on the outside, and spoke toward the wood as though it were a face. "You are seen, friend. You are remembered. The plate is set, the path is wide beyond these walls. Walk on." Silence answered, deep, listening silence. Then the faintest shift, as though something on the other side of the door had inclined its head. No third knock came. Instead, a slow exhalation seemed to pass along the threshold, cool air seeping beneath the door and stirring the ash line into the tiniest gray ripple. The grains settled again, unbroken. The candle on the sill and every turnip flame bowed once in perfect unison, then straightened.
Father waited another slow count of 10, ear to the wood, then stepped back. The poker returned to its hook with a soft, deliberate clink, metal greeting metal, bargain sealed. Mother's lullaby resumed on the exact note it had left, as though no time at all had passed. The youngest loosened her death grip on the doll. The eldest boy let his breath out in a long, trembling stream that fogged and vanished in the warm air. Grandmother lifted the smallest remaining pinch of ash and let it fall through her fingers like dark snow. They have their answer, and we keep ours. Outside, the wind turned over in its sleep and moved on down the lane, brushing the orchard branches in farewell. The lanterns along the road gave one last slow blink, crooked smiles softening into something almost kindly, and held steady. Inside, the fire settled into its lowest, bravest glow, embers pulsing like a heart that has decided for this night at least to beat only for the living.
The family drew the blankets a little closer, leaned a little nearer, and let the quiet hours carry them gently toward morning, safe, unbroken, and politely dismissed by everything that had once come knocking. A faint rustle stirred in the far corner, where the shadows pooled deepest, soft as cloth dragged across dust, deliberate as a foot testing old floorboards long after the house has gone to sleep. Every head turned, yet no one moved. The sound was too polite to be threatening, too purposeful to be the wind. The turnip lantern on the table leaned its flame toward the corner, as though curious. For a heartbeat, the carved mouth seemed to widen, interested. Grandmother's fingers paused on her rosary. She did not look away from the fire, yet her voice found the dark corner without effort. "We see you, little guest. The hearth is warm. The way is open beyond the ash. There is room enough out there for wondering." Father's hand settled, warm and certain, on the eldest boy's shoulder. Mother's lullaby did not falter. If anything, it grew softer, sweeter, the way a river grows quieter when it reaches deep water. The rustle paused, considered. A shape, no larger than a cat, no clearer than wood smoke, seemed to rise a few inches from the floorboards, hover, and settle again. It had no edges, only weight, like memory testing whether it is still welcome. Grandmother lifted the last small pinch of ash between thumb and finger and let it fall into the fire. The embers flared once, gentle and gold, and the scent of sage rose sharp and kind. The shape in the corner thinned, folded itself the way a letter is folded when the message has been read, and slipped away. Not through the wall, not through the floor, but simply out of being there. The rustle became the ordinary creak of old wood cooling, and then became nothing at all. The turnip flames straightened. The candle on the sill stood tall again. Outside, the orchard gave one slow, courteous sigh, as though satisfied. Grandmother closed her eyes, the ghost of a smile touching her mouth. "Gone on," she whispered, politely shone the door and politely took it.
Father's hand lingered a moment longer on the boy's shoulder, then withdrew. Mother's lullaby drifted into its final notes, soft as breath on a mirror. The fire settled into its lowest, friendliest glow, embers winking like sleepy eyes. The children let their own eyes close, one by one, heads sinking against shoulders and laps and the warm curve of blankets. Beyond the windows, the night loosened its hold, frost retreating, lanterns dimming, orchard branches stilling as though tucking themselves in for the last hour before dawn. Inside the small stone cottage, the hearth kept its quiet watch, the ash line lay unbroken, and the family, warm, breathing, and gently victorious, slipped at last into the shallow, protected sleep of those who have kept every ancient courtesy and been left in peace because of it. Outside, the first pale blade of morning began, very softly, to slide between the hills. Grandmother's voice rose again, low and soothing, the way a hand smooths a quilt over a sleeping child. The night is long, but it is not unkind only to the careless. We have been careful, we have kept the old ways, and so the night keeps us.
She let the last grains of ash drift from her fingers. They fell in a fine gray rain, settling across the hearthstones like the gentlest dusting of snow. Where they touched, the floorboards, the faint scuff near the door, grew perfectly still, as though someone had placed a finger to invisible lips. The turnip lantern gave one slow, deliberate wink of flame, its crooked grin widening just enough to seem satisfied, then settled back into its steady, honest glow. Father's hand stayed on the eldest boy's shoulder, warm, certain, a quiet promise that the world beyond the ash line would have to come through him first. The boy leaned into the weight of it and felt, for the first time that night, something lighter than fear. Pride. Mother's lullaby sank to its lowest note, almost a breath rather than a song, and the youngest child's eyes fluttered shut, doll forgotten in loose fingers. The eldest girl rested her cheek against the warm flank of the turnip lantern, trusting its small heat, trusting the carved face that had watched over every Halloween her family had ever kept. A cool ribbon of air slipped beneath the door, tested the ash, found it unbroken, and withdrew without complaint. Outside, the orchard gave one final soft susurration, leaves brushing together like old women exchanging good nights, then folded itself into silence. The lanterns along the road dimmed to embers of their own, patient sentinels waiting for the relief of dawn. Inside, the fire spoke its last gentle words of the night, a soft pop, a sigh of settling logs, the slow heartbeat of coals. Grandmother closed her eyes. The rosary rested quiet in her lap. "Sleep now, loves," she whispered, though no one had asked. "The bargain is kept. Morning will find us all exactly where we are meant to be." One by one, the children's heads grew heavy, breaths deepening, small hands uncurling. The shadows, no longer needed, drew back into their corners like courteous guests who know when the evening has ended. The hearth glowed low and steady, a faithful heart that would burn until the first pale light touched the eastern hills. And somewhere beyond the walls, the night, vast, ancient, and tonight politely satisfied, turned its face toward morning and began, at last, to walk away. The draft curled in, thin and sharp, tasting of iron-cold earth and the first true bite of winter. It lifted the candle flame on the sill until the turnip's carved eyes flared bright, then let it fall again, gentler, almost apologetic. The eldest girl kept her palms against the pane,
feeling the night breathe on the other side of the glass. Moonlight silvered the orchard. Every bare branch stood out like charcoal drawn across pale parchment, and the leaves beneath shifted in slow, deliberate eddies, as though the ground itself turned in its sleep. Inside, the fire answered the cold with a sudden soft roar, a brief bright flare that painted every face gold and pushed the chill back to its proper side of the walls. Grandmother lifted her head. The rosary lay still in her lap now, its work done. "Listen," she whispered, so low only the hearth seemed to hear. "The night is turning its face away." Outside, the wind gathered the last of its voices, rustle of leaf, scrape of branch, distant owl, far-off lantern creaking on its nail, and carried them gently down the valley, farther, farther, until even the echo grew tired. The turnip on the sill gave one final slow wink, its crooked grin softening into something almost tender, and settled into a steady, ordinary glow. Father drew a long, quiet breath and let it out again, the sound of a man lowering a burden he had carried for hours. His hand moved from the eldest boy's shoulder to rest light and certain atop Mother's, where it lay across the children's hair. Mother's lullaby ended on a note so soft it might have been only the fire sighing. The youngest child's fingers uncurled from the doll. The doll's button eyes caught the glow and slept. One by one, the candles and turnips dimmed, not extinguished, simply content. The shadows, no longer needed as messengers, folded themselves into the corners like dark cats curling up for the night.
Somewhere beyond the hills, a cock mistook a strand of moonlight for dawn and crowed once, hoarse and hopeful. The sound drifted over the rooftops, thin as a thread, yet it was enough. The great, watchful night loosened its hold, step by reluctant step, until the only thing pressing against the cottage walls was ordinary autumn chill and the scent of wood smoke drifting from 100 sleeping chimneys. Inside, the hearth settled into a nest of ruby coals that would keep its small red heart beating until true morning. The family slept, heads on shoulders, hands touching hands, breaths slow and even, wrapped in the certain knowledge that every ancient courtesy had been offered and every ancient boundary honored. Outside, the lanterns along the road burned low, the orchard stood quiet, and the moon, thin as a sickle, slipped at last behind the hills to let the stars grow pale. Halloween night, long, patient, and gently satisfied, walked on. And in the little stone cottage, the fire kept watch alone, glowing softly until the first true bird lifted its voice and the sky beyond the shutters turned the color of pearl and rose.
The hearth had become a low, steady heart, no longer roaring, only breathing. Each pulse of amber light reached across the room, touched a cheek, a folded hand, the worn wool of a shawl, then drew back again, satisfied. Father's palm stayed on the eldest boy's shoulder, a quiet weight that said, without words, "I am still here. The night has taken nothing from us." Grandmother let the very last of the ash drift from her fingers. It fell like fine gray snow, settling over the hearthstones until the boundary glowed faintly, a pale, unbreakable ring no shadow would cross tonight. Outside, the orchard gave one final courteous rustle, as though the trees themselves inclined their bare heads and then stood motionless, waiting for dawn the way well-mannered guests wait to be thanked and dismissed. The turnip lanterns, one by one, let their crooked smiles soften. The candle on the sill burned clear and calm, a single bright eye that had seen everything and asked for nothing. Mother's lullaby sank into its lowest, sweetest note and stayed there, barely more than breath, cradling the room the way the fire cradled its embers.
The children's eyelids grew heavy as river stones. The youngest's doll slipped from loose fingers and lay where it fell, button eyes catching the last of the glow. The eldest girl rested her brow against the warm curve of her turnip lantern and felt its small, steady heartbeat through the rough skin. Grandmother folded her hands over the silent rosary and spoke once more, so softly the words seemed to come from the fire itself. The night has walked its round. It found the door barred with kindness, the hearth guarded by memory. It will trouble us no further. A cock crowed, true this time, certain. Faint and far, yet the sound slid under the door like a silver key turning in an ancient lock. The great darkness beyond the windows loosened, thinned, began to lift the way mist lifts from a valley when the first true light touches the hills. Inside, the fire settled into a nest of rubies that would hold its warmth until morning. The cottage exhaled, slow, content, utterly unafraid.
And the family, wrapped in the gentle, unbroken circle of light and breath and love older than any wandering shadow, let the last quiet hour carry them across the threshold of sleep, safely home on the far side of Halloween night. The wind pressed once more against the cottage, cool fingers slipping through the cracks, carrying the thin silver scent of frost and the low, distant murmur of the orchard. It was the last courteous inquiry of the night. Inside, the fire answered with a soft, contented crackle, as though to say, "All is well, all is minded." Grandmother let the final thread of ash fall from her fingers along the sill. The gray dust settled beside the eldest girl's small handprint on the glass, sealing the boundary with quiet finality. "Enough now," she whispered, and the room itself seemed to hear her. "The night has looked its fill. It finds nothing here but warmth and good manners. It will trouble us no more." The turnip lantern gave one last slow, deliberate flicker, its carved mouth curving into something very like a gentle, satisfied smile, before its flame shrank to a steady, sleepy glow.
Outside, the orchard branches stilled. The moon, weary of watching, slipped behind a low cloud and did not return. The lanterns along the road dimmed to tiny, patient coals, content to wait for morning. Father drew the eldest boy against his side. The boy's head settled naturally beneath his chin. Mother gathered the girls closer, her lullaby fading into the soft rhythm of breathing that needed no song anymore. One by one, the children's eyes closed. The youngest's doll slipped to the rug and lay there, button eyes catching the last ember light, like small dark stars finally at rest. Grandmother rested her rosary across her lap and let her own eyes drift shut, a faint smile touching the corners of her mouth. The hearth sighed, banked its fire low, and kept its small red heart beating just enough for the few hours that remained. And the great Halloween night, ancient, curious, and tonight politely refused every invitation to linger, turned away from the little stone cottage, satisfied. It walked on down the valley, footsteps silent on the frost, taking its shadows, its whispers, its patient watchers with it,
until the only thing left outside was ordinary autumn darkness and the clean, cold scent of coming dawn. Inside, the family slept, safe, warm, and gently victorious, cradled by a hearth that remembered every careful soul who had ever sat before it on this night and kept the old bargain. The fire glowed, low and steady. The ash lines held, and morning, when it came, soft, pale, and certain, would find them exactly where they belonged. The rain settled into a gentle, steady voice, no longer tapping, simply speaking against the panes, against the roof, against the whole patient night. Each drop carried the scent of turned earth and ending year, and the cottage drank it in the way old friends drink in one another's quiet company. The fire answered with a low, contented hum, flames curling low and gold, painting the walls in slow, breathing light. Sparks rose, brief as heartbeats, and vanished upward, carrying the last faint messages of the long vigil toward the sky.
Grandmother let the rosary rest. Her hands, for the first time all night, lay still in her lap. "The rain is the night's way of saying goodbye," she said, so softly the words seemed to come from the rafters themselves. "It washes the paths clean for morning." Father's hand stayed on the eldest boy's shoulder, but the grip had eased into something gentler than guarding, more like blessing. The boy leaned into it, eyes half closed, lulled by rain and warmth and the knowledge that every boundary had held. Mother's lullaby thinned to a single repeated note, soft as breath on wool, and the youngest child's fingers uncurled from her doll. The doll lay forgotten, button eyes reflecting the dying fire like small dark pools of water. Outside, the orchard trees let the rain slide from their bare branches without complaint. The lanterns along the road dimmed further, their duty almost done. Somewhere, a cock crowed again, clearer now, more certain, and the great dark that had pressed so close all night began to loosen, to lift, to drift apart like smoke in morning air.
The turnip on the sill gave one final gentle flicker, its crooked grin softening into something very like peace, and settled into a steady, ordinary glow that belonged entirely to the living. Grandmother's eyes closed. A small, satisfied smile curved her mouth. "Listen," she whispered, though no one was awake to hear it, but the house itself. "The night is walking away. It leaves us whole." The rain grew lighter, kinder, a lullaby of its own. And in the little stone cottage, warm, breathing, and gently victorious, the family slept at last, heads pillowed on one another, hands loosely linked, hearts beating slow and sure beneath the watchful, fading embers. Outside, the first pale seam of dawn began to show between the hills, soft rose, uncertain gold, and Halloween night, having been met with every ancient courtesy, turned its face to the coming light and, quietly, graciously, was gone. The footsteps above were soft, almost courteous, the way a guest might walk when he knows the house is asleep and does not wish to wake it. One board, then another, a slow, measured pace that crossed the attic from gable to gable and paused directly over the hearth. The children held their breath without meaning to. The youngest pressed closer to Mother. The doll's head lolled against her chest like a small, trusting animal. Grandmother lifted her eyes to the ceiling, calm as winter water. "Old feet on old boards," she said, voice low and fond. "They remember the way. We remember them. That is enough." She let 3 final beads slip through her fingers. Click, click, click. Then laid the rosary across her knees and simply waited, the way one waits for an elderly neighbor to finish crossing the room. Father's hand tightened once on the boy's shoulder. Not fear, only reminder. We are here. We are many. We are warm. The footsteps paused again, directly above the ring of ash and light. A long, listening silence followed, the kind that has weight and texture. Then the faintest sigh, not wind, not boards, but something older, drifted down through the beams, patient and resigned. The pacing did not resume. Instead, the attic gave one small, settling creak, the sound a house makes when it chooses to lie back down to sleep.
Grandmother smiled, small and certain. "They have paid their respects," she whispered, "and we have paid ours. The bargain holds." The fire answered with a sudden bright pop, a single spark leaping high like a tiny salute before it vanished up the chimney. Outside, the drizzle thinned to the finest mist, the orchard trees letting the last silver drops slide from their branches. The scent of apples and wet earth softened, folded itself into the ordinary smell of a November night that had decided, after all, to be kind. The turnip lantern on the sill gave one last, slow, deliberate nod, its crooked grin easing into something very like relief, and burned low and steady, an ordinary light again. Mother's lullaby returned, softer than breath, and the children's eyelids followed it down. Above them, the attic lay quiet, beams still and patient, holding whatever gentle memories had walked there safely back into silence. The cottage exhaled, slow, content, and utterly unafraid. And somewhere beyond the hills, the first true cock crowed, clear and brave, slicing the dark like a silver knife. The great night loosened its cloak, turned its face to the coming light, and, satisfied, politely dismissed, and carrying no grievance, walked on. Inside the little stone house, the fire kept its small red heart glowing, the ash lines lay unbroken, and the family, warm, breathing, and gently triumphant, slipped across the last quiet hour into the deep, protected sleep of those who have kept every ancient courtesy and been left in perfect peace because of it. Morning, pale and certain, was already waiting at the door. The house itself seemed to settle, like an old dog turning once, twice, and lying down with a satisfied sigh. The faint scuff in the corner paused, listened, and did not come again. The low humming in the walls softened into the gentler rhythm of ordinary timber cooling after a long night of watchfulness.
Grandmother let the rosary rest across her knees and spoke no more. There was nothing left to say. The last thin line of ash she had drawn glowed faintly, then dimmed, its work complete. Father's hand slid from the eldest boy's shoulder to join Mother's, where it lay over the sleeping youngest. The boy's head drooped, the turnip lantern's crooked grin blurred in his closing eyes. One by one, the candles and turnips gave up their crooked smiles and sank into steady, sleeping flames. The fire folded itself into a nest of quiet embers that would hold warmth until morning. Outside, the drizzle ended with a final courteous patter. The orchard stood dripping and still. The lanterns along the road blinked once, slow, grateful, and let their light sink to the barest coals. Somewhere a cock crowed again, nearer now, certain of the coming light. The great Halloween night, having circled the little cottage, tested every latch and window, and found only steady hearts and careful kindness, drew its dark cloak about itself and walked quietly away down the valley.
taking every shadow, every whisper, every curious footstep with it.
Inside, the hearth gave one last soft crackle, like an old friend murmuring good night, and settled into ruby silence. The cottage breathed once, deep and slow, and slept. Morning, pale rose, gold at the edges, gentle as forgiveness, was already leaning against the door, waiting to be let in. And when it came, it would find the family curled together like nesting birds, the ash lines unbroken, the turnips smiling in their sleep, and the house itself humming low and content around them, warm, whole, and gently triumphant on the safe side of another Halloween night. The last lantern on the road gave one slow, deliberate blink, as though it too had been holding its breath all night, and then let its flame sink to a quiet coal. The message was clear. The vigil is over. Inside the cottage, the fire answered with a single soft pop, a final spark rising like a tiny messenger before it vanished up the chimney. The turnip on the sill steadied. Its crooked grin relaxed into something almost sleepy.
Grandmother's rosary clicked once more, then lay still in her lap. Enough, she breathed, and the word carried the weight of centuries. The road is walked, the watch is kept, the night is satisfied. Father's hand slid from the eldest boy's shoulder and came to rest, open and easy, on his knee. Mother's lullaby had already faded into the slow, shared breathing of the family. The eldest boy felt the floorboards beneath his palm grow perfectly quiet. No more scuffs, no more whispers, only the warm, living hush of a house that knows its people are safe. Outside, the mist lifted. The orchard stood bare and dripping, the moon gone pale and thin, ready to slip away. A first true bird lifted its voice somewhere down the valley, tentative, then certain. The great Halloween night, having found every door politely barred, every offering given, every heart steady and kind, gathered its shadows about itself like a traveler pulling up a cloak, and walked on. The hearth glowed low and red, a small, faithful heart that would not quite go out before dawn.
One by one, the children's eyes closed. The youngest child's fingers uncurled from her doll. The eldest girl's head settled against her mother's shoulder. The boy let his hand rest, open and trusting, on the warm floorboards. Grandmother was the last awake. She looked once around the quiet circle, ash lines unbroken, turnips smiling in their sleep, the fire keeping its gentle watch, and allowed herself the smallest, gentlest smile. All is well, she whispered to the house, to the embers, to the coming light. We kept faith. The night kept faith. Then she too closed her eyes. And the cottage, warm, breathing, and gently triumphant, slept safe in the arms of the fading dark, while morning, soft as forgiveness and bright as promise, came quietly down the valley to open the door. And in that layered cadence, the last hour of Halloween slipped quietly away. The breathing of the family slowed, deepened, became one single tide. The fire, content at last, folded its wings of flame and settled into a nest of ruby coals that pulsed like a sleeping heart. The turnip lantern gave one final, drowsy flicker, its crooked grin softening into something almost human, and let its flame sink to a steady, watchful bead of gold. Grandmother's rosary lay still across her lap, the beads warm from her hands. No more ash was needed. The boundaries had been drawn, acknowledged, and honored on both sides. Outside, the orchard stood silent. The mist had lifted. The moon had set. The lanterns along the road burned low and peaceful, their duty gently, perfectly fulfilled. A single cock crowed from the village, clear, certain, and kind. The sound drifted through the shutters like a silver key turning in a lock that had never truly been in danger. The great night exhaled, gathered its shadows, its whispers, its soft footsteps and curious sighs, and walked away down the valley without looking back. Inside the little stone cottage, nothing stirred now except the slow rise and fall of sleeping breaths and the quiet, faithful glow of embers that would hold warmth until dawn.
Morning, soft, pale, and smiling, pressed its cheek to the window panes, waiting only for the first child to open an eye before it stepped inside and declared the long vigil over. All was safe, all was warm, all was gently, perfectly, triumphantly well. And Halloween night, having been met with nothing but steady love and ancient courtesy, left the little family in peace and went quietly on its way. The turnip's flame gave one last slow bow, deep, deliberate, almost grateful, then settled into a single steady bead of light. The crooked mouth softened. For an instant it looked less like a warning and more like a quiet blessing. Grandmother let the rosary fall still. "It is finished," she whispered, and the house itself seemed to hear. Father's hand slid from the eldest boy's shoulder and came to rest, open and easy, over Mother's. The boy's eyelids drooped. The warmth of the stones beneath his palms had become the warmth of sleep. One by one the children slipped across the gentle border. The youngest child's head lolled against her mother's breast, breath soft as thistledown. The eldest girl's fingers uncurled from the turnip's rough skin and lay open on her lap. The eldest boy's cheek settled against the warm floorboards, a small, trusting weight. Mother's lullaby ended on a note that was barely sound at all, only the memory of sound, while the fire answered with a final, contented sigh, folding its wings of gold into quiet ruby coals. Outside, the orchard stood silent, washed clean. The lanterns along the road had burned to the gentlest embers, their crooked faces dimmed to sleepy kindness. A single cock crowed again, nearer, surer, and the darkness, ancient, patient, and tonight perfectly courteous, loosened its cloak and walked away down the valley without a backward glance. Inside the little cottage, nothing moved now except the slow rise and fall of sleeping breaths and the faithful heartbeat of the hearth. Grandmother was the last to close her eyes. She looked once around the circle, ash lines unbroken, turnips smiling in their dreams, shadows curled like cats at the edge of the light, and allowed herself the smallest, softest smile.
"The night came," she murmured to the quiet room, "and we were kind. It leaves, and we are whole." Then she too let sleep take her. Morning, pale rose, gold at the edges, gentle as mercy, pressed its face to the windows, waited a courteous moment, and stepped softly inside. Halloween was over. The cottage slept on, warm and safe and gently victorious, wrapped in the hush that comes after every ancient promise has been beautifully, perfectly kept. The shadows finished their last slow waltz, bowed toward the hearth, and folded themselves into the corners like tired dancers at the end of a very long evening. The turnip lantern gave one final gentle sigh of flame. its crooked grin softening until it looked almost sleepy, almost ordinary. The light inside it settled into a single steady heartbeat of gold. Grandmother let the rosary rest. "The dance is done," she whispered to the quiet room. "We kept time with it, and it kept time with us."
Father's hand slid from the boy's shoulder and came to rest over Mother's, linking the circle. The eldest boy's head drooped. His palms, still pressed to the warm floorboards, relaxed and opened like small flowers giving themselves to sleep. Mother's lullaby had long since become only breath, soft and even, rising and falling with the children's. Outside, the orchard stood motionless, washed clean by rain and mist. The last lantern on the road blinked once more, slow, courteous, final, and let its light sink to a quiet ember. A cock crowed from the village, clear and certain now, and the great Halloween night, having walked every path, tested every latch, and found nothing but steady hearts and gentle kindness, drew its dark cloak close, turned its face to the pale seam of light along the hills, and walked quietly, gratefully away. Inside the little cottage, the fire glowed low and red, a faithful heart that would not quite go out before morning. One by one, the children crossed the gentle border into sleep. The youngest curled like a kitten,
The eldest girl's cheek against the warm turnip's flank, the boy's hand still open on the floorboards as though the house itself had taken it. Grandmother was the last awake. She looked once around the circle, ash lines unbroken, turnips dreaming, shadows curled and harmless, and let her eyes close. All is well, she breathed, to the hearth, to the sleeping house, to the coming dawn. We kept the old bargain, the night kept its word. Then sleep took her too. Morning, soft rose, pale gold, gentle as mercy, slipped its fingers beneath the door, brushed the embers awake, and stepped quietly inside. Halloween was over. The cottage slept on, warm, whole, and gently victorious, wrapped in the hush that follows every perfect keeping of the ancient promise. And when the children woke, the turnips would still be smiling, the hearth would still be warm, and the night, long, patient, and tonight beautifully satisfied, would be only a memory of kindness returned for kindness, fading like mist in the first true light of November.
The house gave one last slow, contented creak, the sound of old bones stretching after a long night's watch, and then grew perfectly still, as though it too had decided the vigil was over. Grandmother's rosary slipped from her fingers and lay quiet in her lap. "The floor has spoken its good night," she murmured, eyes already half closed. "We may answer with sleep." Father's hand left the eldest boy's shoulder only long enough to pull a blanket higher over the youngest, then settled again, lighter now, more benediction than guard. Outside, the orchard branches brushed the shutters once more, soft, almost tender, then let the breeze carry them away. The rain-slick leaves gave a final rustling sigh and fell silent. The turnip lantern on the sill dimmed to a single bead of gold, its crooked grin now nothing more than a sleepy, satisfied curve. The hearth answered with a low ruby glow, coals pulsing once, twice, then settling into the steady heartbeat of a fire that knows its people are safe.
One by one, the children crossed over, the youngest with a small, contented sound against her mother's breast, the eldest girl's cheek sliding gently to rest against the warm flank of the turnip. the boy's hands still open on the floorboards, fingers loosening as the house's quiet song carried him under. Mother's lullaby ended in the softest exhale. Father's eyes closed last of all the adults. A final sweep of the room, finding only sleeping faces, unbroken ash lines, and the gentle, faithful glow of embers. Grandmother was already breathing the slow, even breath of deep sleep, the faintest smile touching her mouth. A cock crowed from the village, clear, triumphant, and very near. The first pale blade of true dawn slid between the hills and touched the window panes with rose and gold. Halloween night, having walked every path around the cottage, tested every latch, and met only calm hearts and ancient kindness, gathered its shadows, its whispers, its soft footsteps and curious sighs, and walked quietly away down the valley, forever.
The hearth kept its small red heart glowing just long enough to greet the morning. And when the family woke, hours later, tangled in blankets, cheeks flushed with sleep and safety, they would find the turnips still smiling, the ash lines undisturbed, and the house humming low and warm around them, as though it too had dreamed only of peace. The long watch was over. All was well. All was gently, perfectly, triumphantly well. The breeze slipped in, cool and courteous, touched each cheek once, a last cool fingertip of the night, saying goodbye, then withdrew as gently as it had come. The turnip lantern answered with a single, steady pulse of light, its crooked mouth now nothing more than a quiet, sleepy smile. Grandmother let the rosary rest entirely. The wind has carried its message, she breathed, eyes closing. We listened. It is satisfied. Father's hand eased from the eldest boy's shoulder and came to rest over the linked hands of the sleeping children. The boy's head settled against his father's knee, breath slow and trusting. Mother's lullaby had already become the soft rise and fall of 5 sleeping hearts. Outside, the orchard gave one final soft rustle, a courteous bow, and stood still. The last lantern on the road blinked once, twice, then let its flames sink to a single ember that glowed like a closing eye. A cock crowed, clear, triumphant, very near. Dawn's pale rose edge crept along the hills and slipped beneath the door like warm milk. The great Halloween night, ancient, watchful, and tonight perfectly answered, gathered its cool breezes, its soft footsteps, its patient shadows, and walked away down the valley, leaving only the clean scent of frost and the faint sweetness of apples behind. Inside the little cottage, the hearth glowed low and ruby, a small, faithful heart keeping its last quiet watch. The children slept on, tangled together like puppies. The youngest curled against her mother's breast, the eldest girl's cheek against the warm turnip's flank, the boy's hand open on the floorboards, as though the house itself held it. Grandmother's head nodded forward, the faintest smile curved her mouth.
Morning stepped softly inside, touched the embers awake, brushed the turnips' crooked grins with gold, and settled over the room like a blessing. Halloween was gone. All that remained was warmth, the faint scent of sage and honey, and the gentle, perfect hush that follows a night when every ancient promise was kept with love. The cottage slept safe and whole, cradled in the first true light of November, and the house, old timber, old stones, old caring heart, hummed once, low and content,
and slept with them. And so the cottage breathed its final quiet breath of the night. The last ember and the hearth gave a soft, contented pop, like a kiss goodnight. The turnip lantern's crooked grin eased into the gentlest curve, its flame shrinking to a single golden bead that glowed only for the sleeping house. Grandmother's rosary slipped from her fingers and lay still. Father's arm tightened once, protectively, around the children, then relaxed into the easy weight of love that needs no guarding now. Mother's lullaby ended on a note so soft it became the hush itself.
Outside, the orchard stood motionless. The last lantern on the road blinked once, slow, tender, final, and let its light go out. A cock crowed, clear and certain, and the great Halloween night, ancient, patient, and tonight perfectly, beautifully answered, drew its dark cloak close, turned its face to the pale rose along the hills, and walked quietly away forever. Inside the little stone cottage there was only the slow, shared breathing of 6 sleeping souls, the faint, ruby heartbeat of the coals, and the gentle, unbroken hush of a house that knows its people are safe. Morning, soft as forgiveness, warm as fresh bread, slipped its fingers beneath the door, brushed the turnips awake with gold, and settled over the room like the gentlest blanket. The long vigil was over. Every ancient courtesy had been kept. Every shadow had been met only with kindness and calm. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the scent of wood smoke, honey, and autumn earth linger in your lungs. Let the memory of crooked lantern grins and quiet ash lines cradle you. You are held just as they were held, in the same timeless, tender watch.
Good night. Sleep deeply. The cottage is still warm. The night has gone kindly on its way, and dawn is already smiling at the window. All is well. All is gently, perfectly well.